Energized Enthusiasm by Aleister Crowley. This essay was included in his Equinox, Volume 1, Number 9, which he wrote in 1913. It begins, A Note on Theurgy. 1. Yao, the Supreme One of the Gnostics, the true God, is the Lord of this work. Let us therefore invoke him by that name which the companions of the Royal Arch blaspheme to aid us in the essay to declare the means which he has bestowed upon us. 2. The divine consciousness, which is reflected and refracted in the works of genius, feeds upon a certain secretion, as I believe. This secretion is analogous to semen, but not identical with it. There are but few men and fewer women, those women being invariably androgyne, who possess it at any time in any quantity. So closely is this secretion connected with the sexual economy that it appears to me at times as if it might be a byproduct of that process which generates semen. That some form of this doctrine has been generally accepted is shown in the prohibitions of all religions. Sanctity has been assumed to depend on chastity, and chastity has nearly always been interpreted as abstinence. But I doubt whether the relation is so simple as this would imply. For example, I find in myself that manifestations of mental creative force always concur with some abnormal condition of the physical powers of generation. But it is not the case that long periods of chastity, on the one hand, or excess of orgies on the other, are favorable to its manifestation or even to its formation. I know myself, and in me it is extremely strong. Its results are astounding. For example, I wrote Tannhauser, complete from conception to execution, in 67 consecutive hours. I was unconscious of the fall of nights and days, even after stopping, nor was there any reaction of fatigue. This work was written when I was 24 years old, immediately on the completion of an orgy, which would normally have tired me out. Often, and often I have noticed that sexual satisfaction, so called, has left me dissatisfied and unfatigued, and let loose floods of verse which have disgraced my career. Yet, on the contrary, a period of chastity has sometimes fortified me for a great outburst. This is far from being invariably the case. At the conclusion of the K2 expedition, after 5 months of chastity, I did no work whatever, barring very few odd lyrics, for months afterwards. I may mention the year 1911. At this time I was living in excellent good health with the woman who I loved. Her health was, however, variable, and we were both constantly worried. The weather was continuously fine and hot. For a period of about 3 months I hardly missed a morning. Always on walking I burst out with a new idea, which had to be written down. The total energy of my being was very high. My weight was 10 stone 8 pounds, which had been my fighting weight when I was 10 years younger. We walked some 20 miles daily through the hilly forest. The amount of MSS written at this time is astounding. Their variety is even more so. Of their excellence I will not speak. Here's a rough list from my memory. It is far from exhaustive. Here he goes on to list some of the works he wrote at the time. Some dozen books of AA instruction, including Liber Astarte and the Temple of Solomon the King for Equinox 7. Short stories, The Woodcutter, His Secret Sin. Plays, His Majesty's Fiddler, Elder Eel, Adonis, written straight off one. The Ghouls, after the other, and Mortatello. Poems, The Sevenfold Sacrament, A Birthday. Fundamentals of the Greek Kabbalah, involving the collection and analysis of several thousand works. I think this phenomenon is unique in the history of literature. I may further refer to my second journey to Algeria, where my sexual life, though fairly full, had been unsatisfactory. On quitting Biskra, I was so full of ideas that I had to get off the train at El Kantara, where I wrote The Scorpion. 5 or 6 poems were written on the way to Paris. the ordeal of Ida Pendragon during my 24-hour stay in Paris, and Snowstorm, and the electric silence immediately on my return to England. To sum up, I can always trace a connection between my sexual condition and the condition of artistic creation, which is so close as to approach identity, and yet so loose that I cannot predicate a single important proposition. It is these considerations which give me pain when I am reproached by the ignorant with wishing to produce genius mechanically. I may fail, but my failure is 1,000 times greater than their utmost success. I shall therefore base my remarks not so much on the observations which I have myself made, and the experiments which I have tried, as on the accepted classical methods of producing that energized enthusiasm which is the lever that moves God. 3. The Greeks say that there are 3 methods of discharging the genial secretion of which I have spoken. They thought perhaps that their methods tended to secrete it, but this I do not believe altogether, or without a qualm. For the manifestation of force implies force, and this force must have come from somewhere. Easier I find it to say subconsciousness and secretion than to postulate an external reservoir, to extend my connotation of man than to invent God. However, parsimony apart, I find it in my experience that it is useless to flog a tired horse. There are times when I am absolutely bereft of even one drop of this elixir. Nothing will restore it, neither rest in bed, nor drugs, nor exercise. On the other hand, sometimes when, after a severe spell of work, I have been dropping with physical fatigue, perhaps sprawling on the floor, too tired to move hand or foot, the occurrence of an idea has restored me to perfect intensity of energy, and the working out of the idea has actually got rid of the aforesaid physical fatigue, although it involved a great additional labor. Exactly parallel, nowhere meeting, is the case of mania. A madman may struggle against 6 trained athletes for hours and show no sign of fatigue. Then he will suddenly collapse, but at a second's notice from the irritable idea will resume the struggle as fresh as ever. Until we discovered unconscious muscular action and its effects, it was rational to suppose such a man possessed of a devil. And the difference between the madman and the genius is not in the quantity, but in the quality of their work. Genius is organized, madness chaotic. Often the organization of genius is on original lines, and ill-balanced and ignorant medicine mistake it for disorder. Time has shown that Whistler and Gauguin kept rules, as well as the masters whom they were supposed to be upsetting. 4. The Greeks say that there are 3 methods of discharging the Leyden jar of genius. These 3 methods they assign to 3 gods. These three gods are Dionysus, Apollo, and Aphrodite. In English, wine, woman, and song. Now it would be a great mistake to imagine that the Greeks were recommending a visit to a brothel. As well, condemn the high mass at St. Peter's on the strength of having witnessed a Protestant revival meeting. Disorder is always a parody of order, because there is no archetypal disorder that it might resemble. Owen Seaman can parody a poet, but nobody can parody Owen Seaman. I guess he's an example of chaos or disorder. A critic is a bundle of impressions. There is no ego behind it. All photographs are essentially alike. The works of all good painters essentially differ. Some writers suppose that in the ancient rites of Eleusis, the high priest publicly copulated with the high priestess. Were this so, it would be no more indecent than it is blasphemous for the priest to make bread and wine into the body and blood of God. True, the Protestants say that it is blasphemous, but a Protestant is one to whom all things sacred are profane, whose mind, being all filth, can see nothing in the sexual act but a crime or a jest, whose only facial gestures are the sneer and the leer. Protestantism is the excrement of human thought, and, accordingly, in Protestant countries, art, if it exists at all, only exists to revolt. let us return from this unsavory illusion to our consideration of the methods of the Greeks. Wow, going hard on Protestantism, Crowley. 5. Agree then that it does not follow from the fact that wine, woman, and song make the sailor's tavern that these ingredients must necessarily concoct a hell broth. There are some people so simple as to think that, when they have proved the religious instinct to be a mere efflorescence of the sex instinct, they have destroyed religion. We should rather consider that the sailor's tavern gives him his only glimpse of heaven, just as the destructive criticism of the phalliциsts have only proved sex to be a sacrament. Consciousness, says the materialist, axe in hand, is a function of the brain. He has only reformulated the old saying, "Your bodies are the temples of the Holy Ghost." Now, sex is justly hallowed in this sense, that it is the eternal fire of the race. Huxley admitted that some of the lower animalculae are in a sense immortal, because they go on reproducing eternally by fission, and however often you divide X by 2, there is always something left. But he never seems to have seen that mankind is immortal in exactly the same sense and goes on reproducing itself with similar characteristics through the ages, changed by circumstance indeed, but always identical in itself. But the spiritual flower of this process is that at the moment of discharge a physical ecstasy occurs, a spasm analogous to the mental spasm which meditation gives. And further, in the sacramental and ceremonial use of the sexual act, the divine consciousness may be attained. 6. The sexual act being then a sacrament, it remains to consider in what respect this limits the employment of the organs. First, it is obviously legitimate to employ them for their natural physical purpose. But if it be allowable to use them ceremonially for a religious purpose, we shall find the act hedged about with many restrictions. For in this case the organs become holy. It matters little to mere propagation that men should be vicious. The most debauched roue might and almost certainly would beget more healthy children than a semi-sexed prude. So the so-called moral restraints are not based on reason, thus they are neglected, but admit its religious function, and one may at once lay down that the act must not be profaned. It must not be undertaken lightly and foolishly without excuse. It may be undertaken for the direct object of continuing the race. It may be undertaken in obedience to real passion, for passion, as the name implies, is rather inspired by a force of divine strength and beauty without the will of the individual, often even against it. It is the casual or habitual, what Christ called idle, use, or rather abuse of these forces, which constitutes their profanation. It will further be obvious that, if the act in itself is to be the sacrament in a religious ceremony, this act must be accomplished solely for the love of God. All personal considerations must be banished utterly. Just as any priest can perform the miracle of transubstantiation, so can any man possessing the necessary qualifications perform this other miracle, whose nature must form the subject of a subsequent discussion. Personal aims being destroyed, it is a fortiori necessary to neglect social and other similar considerations. Physical strength and beauty are necessary and desirable for aesthetic reasons, the attention of the worshippers being liable to distraction if the celebrants are ugly, deformed, or incompetent. I need hardly emphasize the necessity for the strictest self-control and concentration on their part, as it would be blasphemy to enjoy the gross taste of the wine of the sacrament. So must the celebrant suppress even the minutest manifestation of animal pleasure. Of the qualifying tests there is no necessity to speak. It is sufficient to say that the adepts have always known how to secure efficiency. Needless also to insist on a similar quality in the assistants. The sexual excitement must be suppressed and transformed into its religious equivalent. 7. With these preliminaries settled in order to guard against foreseen criticisms of those Protestants who, God having made them a little lower than the angels, have made themselves a great deal lower than the beasts by their consistently bestial interpretation of all things human and divine, we may consider first the triune nature of these ancient methods of energizing enthusiasm. Music has two parts, tone or pitch, and rhythm. The latter quality associates it with the dance, and that part of dancing which is not rhythm is sex. Now that part of sex, which is not a form of the dance, animal movement, is intoxication of the soul, which connects it with wine. Further identities will suggest themselves to the student. By the use of the three methods in one, the whole being of a man may thus be stimulated. The music will create a general harmony of the brain, leading it in its own paths. The wine affords a general stimulus of the animal nature, and the sex excitement elevates the moral nature of the man by its close analogy with the highest ecstasy. It remains, however, always for him to make the final transmutation. Unless he have the special secretion which I have postulated, the result will be commonplace. So consonant is this system with the nature of man that it is exactly parodied and profaned not only in the sailor's tavern, but in the society ball. Here, for the lowest natures, the result is drunkenness, disease, and death. For the middle natures, a gradual blunting of the finer feelings. For the higher, an exhilaration amounting at the best to the foundation of a lifelong love. If these society rites are properly performed, there should be no exhaustion. After a ball, one should feel the need of a long walk in the young morning air. This weariness or boredom, the headache or solemnance, are nature's warnings. That's poignant. 8. Now, the purpose of such a ball, the moral attitude on entering, seems to me to be of supreme importance. If you go with the idea of killing time, you are rather killing yourself. Baudelaire speaks of the first period of love when the boy kisses the trees of the wood rather than kiss nothing. At the age of 36, I found myself at Pompeii passionately kissing that great grave statue of a woman that stands in the avenue of the tombs. Even now, as I wake in the morning, I sometimes fall to kissing my own arms. It is with such a feeling that one should go to a ball, and with such a feeling intensified, purified, and exalted that one should leave it. If this be so, how much more if one go with the direct religious purpose burning in one's whole being? Beethoven roaring at the sunrise is no strange spectacle to me, who shout with joy and wonder when I understand, without which one cannot really be said ever to see, a blade of grass. I fall upon my knees in speechless adoration at the moon. I hide my eyes in holy awe from a good Van Gogh. Imagine then a ball in which the music is the choir celestial, the wine of the Graal, or that of the Sabbath of the Adepts, and one's partner, the infinite and eternal one, the true and living God Most High. Go even to a common ball. The Moulin de la Galette will serve even the least of my magicians. With your whole soul aflame within you, and your whole will concentrated on these, and substantiations, and tell me what miracle takes place. It is the hate of, the distaste for life that sends one to the ball when one is old. When one is young, one is on springs until the hour falls. But the love of God, which is the only true love, diminishes not with age. It grows deeper and intenser with every satisfaction. It seems as if in the noblest men this secretion constantly increases, which certainly suggests an external reservoir, so that age loses all its bitterness. We find Brother Lawrence, Nicholas Herman of Lorraine, at the age of 80 in continuous enjoyment of union with God. Buddha at an equal age would run up and down the 8 high trances like an acrobat on a ladder. Stories not too dissimilar are told of Bishop Berkeley. Many persons have not attained union at all until middle age, and then have rarely lost it. It is true that genius, in the ordinary sense of the word, has nearly always showed itself in the young. Perhaps we should regard such cases as Nicholas Herman as cases of acquired genius. Now I am certainly of opinion that genius can be acquired, or in the alternative, that it is an almost universal possession. Its rarity may be attributed to the crushing influence of a corrupted society. It is rare to meet a youth without high ideals, generous thoughts, a sense of holiness, of his own importance, which, being interrupted, is of his own identity with God. 3 years in the world, and he is a bank clerk or even a government official. Only those who intuitively understand from early boyhood that they must stand out, and who have the incredible courage and endurance to do so in the face of all that tyranny, callousness, and the scorn of inferiors can do. Only these arrive at manhood uncontaminated. Every serious or spiritual thought is made a jest. Poets are thought soft and cowardly, apparently because they are the only boys with a will of their own and courage to hold out against the whole school, boys and masters in league as once were Pilate and Herod. Honor is replaced by expediency, holiness by hypocrisy. Even where we find thoroughly good seed sprouting in favorable ground, too often is there a frittering away of the forces. Facile encouragement of a poet or painter is far worse for him than any amount of opposition. Here again the sex question, SQ so called by Tolstoyans, chastity mongers, nut fooders, and such who talk and think of nothing else, intrudes its horrid head. I believe that every boy is originally conscious of sex as sacred, but he does not know what it is. With infinite diffidence he asks, the master replies with holy horror, the boy with a low leer, a furtive laugh, perhaps worse. I am inclined to agree with the headmaster of Eton that pederastic passions among schoolboys do no harm. Further, I think them the only redeeming feature of sexual life at public schools. The Hindus are wiser. At the well-watched hour of puberty, the boy is prepared for a sacrament. He is led to a duly consecrated temple, and there, by a wise and holy woman, skilled in the art, and devoted to this end, he is initiated with all solemnity into the mystery of life. The act is thus declared religious, sacred, impersonal, utterly apart from amorism and eroticism and animalism and sentimentalism and all the other vilenesses that Protestantism has made of it. The Catholic Church did, I believe, to some extent, preserve the pagan tradition. Marriage is a sacrament. Of course, there has been a school of devilish ananders that has held the act in itself to be wicked. Of such blasphemers of nature, let no further word be said. But in the attempt to deprive the act of all accretions which would profane it, the fathers of the Church added in spite of themselves other accretions which profaned it more. They tied it to property and inheritance. They wished it to serve both God and Mammon. Rightly restraining the priest who should employ his whole energy in the miracle of the Mass, they found their counsel a counsel of perfection. The magical tradition was in part lost. The priest could not do what was expected of him, and the unexpended portion of his energy turned sour. Hence the thoughts of priests, like the thoughts of modern faddists, revolved eternally around the sex question. A special and secret Mass, a Mass of the Holy Ghost, a Mass of the mystery of the Incarnation, to be performed at stated intervals, might have saved both monks and nuns, given the Church eternal dominion of the world. 9. To return, The rarity of genius is in great part due to the destruction of its young. Even as in physical life, that is a favored plant, one of whose 1,000 seeds ever shoots forth a blade, so do conditions kill all but the strongest sons of genius. Just as rabbits increased apace in Australia, where even a missionary has been known to beget 90 children in 2 years, so shall we be able to breed genius if we can find the conditions which hamper it and remove them. The obvious practical step to take is to restore the rights of Bacchus, Aphrodite, and Apollo to their proper place. They should not be open to everyone. A manhood should be the reward of ordeal and initiation. The physical tests should be severe, and weaklings should be killed out rather than artificially preserved. The same remark applies to intellectual tests, but such tests should be as wide as possible. I was an absolute duffer at school in all forms of athletics and games, because I despised them. I held, and still hold, numerous mountaineering world's records. Similarly, examinations fail to test intelligence. Cecil Rhodes refused to employ any man with a university degree. That such degrees lead to honor in England is a sign of England's decay, though even in England they are usually the stepping stones to clerical idleness or pedagogic slavery. Such is a dotted outline of the picture that I wish to draw. If the power to possess property depended on a man's competence and his perception of real values, a new aristocracy would at once be created, and the deadly fact that social consideration varies with the power of purchasing champagne would cease to be a fact. Our our Pluto hetero politicocracy, politicocracy would fall in a day. Thank you all for staying with me through that. But I am only too well aware that such a picture is not likely to be painted. We can then only work patiently and in secret. We must select suitable material and train it in utmost reverence to these 3 master methods, or aiding the soul in its genial organism. It's some Crowley implying some necessity for social control, social engineering. Not something I ever get behind. 10. This reverent attitude is of an importance which I cannot overrate. Normal people find normal relief from any general or special excitement in the sexual act. Commander Marston, R.N., whose experiments in the effort of the tom-tom on the married Englishwoman are classical and conclusive, has admirably described how the vague unrest which she at first shows gradually assumes the sexual form and culminates, if allowed to do so, in shameless masturbation or indecent advances. But this is a natural corollary of the proposition that married Englishwomen are usually unacquainted with sexual satisfaction. Their desires are constantly stimulated by brutal and ignorant husbands, and never gratified. This fact again accounts for the amazing prevalence of Sapphism in London society. The Hindus warn their pupils against the dangers of breathing exercises. Indeed, the slightest laxness in moral or physical tissues may cause the energy accumulated by the practice to discharge itself by involuntary emission. I have known this happen in my own experience. It is then of the utmost importance to realize that the relief of the tension is to be found in what the Hebrews and the Greeks called prophesying, and which is better when organized into art. The disorderly discharge is mere waste, a wilderness of howlings. The orderly discharge is a Prometheus unbound, or l'âge d'Aran, according to special aptitudes of the enthused person. But it must be remembered that special aptitudes are very easy to acquire if the driving force of enthusiasm be great. If you cannot keep the rules of others, you make rules of your own. One set turns out in the long run to be just as good as another. Henry Rousseau, the douanier, was laughed at all his life. I laughed as heartily as the rest, though, almost despite myself, I kept on saying, as the phrase goes, that I felt something, couldn't say what. The moment it occurred to somebody to put up all his paintings in one room by themselves, it was instantly apparent that his naivete was the simplicity of a master. Let no one then imagine that I fail to perceive or underestimate the dangers of employing these methods. The occurrence even of so simple a matter as fatigue might change la meninas into a stupid sexual crisis. It will be necessary for most Englishmen to emulate the self-control of the Arabs and Hindus, whose ideal is to deflower the greatest possible number of virgins. 80 is considered a fairly good performance without completing the act. Okay. It is indeed of the first importance for the celebrant in any phallic rite to be able to complete the act without even once allowing a sexual or sensual thought to invade his mind. The mind must be as absolutely detached from one's own body as it is from another person's. 11. Of the musical instruments, few are suitable. The human voice is the best and the only one which can be usefully employed in chorus. Anything like an orchestra implies infinite rehearsal and introduces an atmosphere of artificiality. The organ is a worthy solo instrument and is an orchestra in itself, while its tone and associations favor the religious idea. The violin is the most useful of all, for its very mood expresses the hunger for the infinite, and yet it is so mobile that it has a greater emotional range than any of its competitors. Accompaniment must be dispensed with unless a harpist be available. The harmonium is a horrible instrument, if only because of its associations, and the piano is like unto it, although, if unseen and played by a Paderewski, it would serve. The trumpet and the bell are excellent to startle at the crisis of a ceremony. Hot, drubbing, passionate, in a different class of ceremony, a class more intense and direct, but on the whole less exalted, the tom-tom stands alone. It combines well with the practice of mantra, and is the best accompaniment for any sacred dance. Okay. 12. Of the sacred dances, the most practical for gathering is the seated dance. One sits cross-legged on the floor and sways to and fro from the hips in time with the mantra. A solo or duet of dancers as a spectacle rather distracts from this exercise. I would suggest a very small and very brilliant light on the floor in the middle of the room. Such a room is best floored with mosaic marble. An ordinary Freemason's lodge carpet is not a bad thing. The eyes, if they see anything at all, see then only the rhythmical or mechanical squares leading in perspective to the simple, unwinking light. The swinging of the body with the mantra, which has a habit of rising and falling as if of its own accord in a very weird way, becomes more accentuated. Ultimately, a curiously spasmodic stage occurs, and then the consciousness flickers and goes out. Perhaps breaks through into the divine consciousness, perhaps is merely recalled to itself by some variable in external impression. The above is a very simple description of a very simple and earnest form of ceremony, based entirely upon rhythm. It is very easy to prepare, and its results are usually very encouraging for the beginner. 13. Wine being a mocker and strong drink raging, its use is more likely to lead to trouble than mere music. One essential difficulty is dosage. One needs exactly enough, and, as Blake points out, one can only tell what is enough by taking too much. For each man the dose varies enormously. So does it for the same man at different times. The ceremonial escape from this is to have a noiseless attendant to bear the bowl of libation, and present it to each in turn, at frequent intervals. Small doses should be drunk, and the bowl passed on, taken as the worshipper deems advisable. Yet the cupbearer should be an initiate and use his own discretion before presenting the bowl. The slightest sign that intoxication is mastering the man should be assigned to him to pass that man. To pass that man. This practice can be easily fitted to the ceremony previously described. If desired, instead of wine, the elixir introduced by me to Europe may be employed. What elixir did he introduce? But its results, if used in this way, have not as yet been thoroughly studied. It is my immediate purpose to repair this neglect. 14. The sexual excitement, which must complete the harmony of method, offers a more difficult problem. It is exceptionally desirable that the actual bodily movements involved should be decorous in the highest sense, and many people are so ill-trained that they will be unable to regard such a ceremony with any but critical or lascivious eyes. Either would be fatal to all the good already done. It is presumably better to wait until all present are greatly exalted before risking a profanation. It is not desirable, in my opinion, that the ordinary worshippers should celebrate in public. The sacrifice should be single, whether or not. 15. Thus far I had written when the distinguished poet, this is interesting, thus far I had written when the distinguished poet, whose conversation with me upon the mysteries had incited me to jot down these few rough notes, knocked at my door. I told him that I was at work on the ideas suggested by him, and that, well, I was rather stuck. He asked permission to glance at the MS, for he reads English fluently, though speaking but a few words, and having done so, kindled and said, "If you come with me now, we will finish your essay." Glad enough of any excuse to stop working, the more plausible the better, I hastened to take down my coat and hat. "By the way," he remarked in the automobile, "I take it that you don't mind me giving the word of the Rose Croix." Surprised, I exchanged the secrets of INRI with him. "And now, very excellent and perfect prince," he said, "what follows is under this seal." And he gave me the most solemn of all Masonic tokens. "You are about," said he, "to compare your ideal with our real." He touched a bell. The automobile stopped, and we got out. He dismissed the chauffeur. "Come," he said. "We have a brisk half-mile." We walked through the thick woods to an old house, where we were greeted in silence by a gentleman who, though in our court dress, wore a very practicable sword. On satisfying him, we were passed through a corridor to an anteroom, where another armed guardian awaited us. He, after a further examination, proceeded to offer me a court dress, the insignia of a sovereign prince of Rose Croix, and a garter and mantle, the former of green silk, the latter of green velvet, and lined with cerise silk. "It is a low mass," whispered the guardian. In this anteroom were 3 or 4 others, both ladies and gentlemen, busily robing. In a third room, we found a procession formed and joined it. There were 26 of us in all. Passing a final guardian, we reached the chapel itself, at whose entrance stood a young man and a young woman, both dressed in simple robes of white silk, embroidered with gold, red, and blue. The former bore a torch of resinous wood. The latter sprayed us as we passed with an attar of roses from a cup. The room in which we now were had at one time been a chapel, so much its shape declared, but the high altar was covered with a cloth that displayed the rose and cross, while above it were ranged 7 candelabra, each of 7 branches. The stalls had been retained, and at each knight's hand burned a taper of rose-colored wax, and a bouquet of roses was before him. In the center of the nave was a great cross, a cavalry cross of 10 squares, measuring, say, 6 feet by 5, painted in red upon a white board, at whose edge were rings through which passed gilt staves. At each corner was a banner, bearing lion, bull, eagle, and man, and from the top of their staves sprang a canopy of blue, wherein were figured in gold the 12 emblems of the zodiac. Knights and dames being installed, suddenly a bell tinkled in the architrave. Instantly all rose. The doors opened at a trumpet peal from without, and herald advanced, followed by the high priest and priestess. The high priest was a man of nearly 60 years, if I may judge by the white beard, but he walked with the springy yet assured step of the 30s. The high priestess, a proud, tall, somber woman of perhaps 30 summers, walked by his side, their hands raised and touching as in the minuet. Their trains were borne by the two youths who had admitted us. All this while an unseen organ played an introit. These ceased as they took their places at the altar. They faced west, waiting. On the closing of the doors, the armed guard, who was clothed in a scarlet robe instead of green, drew his sword and went up and down the aisle, chanting exorcisms and swinging the great sword. All present drew their swords and faced outward, holding the points in front of them. This part of the ceremony appeared interminable. When it was over, the girl and boy reappeared, bearing the one a bowl and the other a censer, singing some litany or other, apparently in Greek, though I could not catch the words. They purified and consecrated the chapel. Now the high priest and high priestess began a litany in rhythmic lines of equal length. At each third response, they touched hands in a peculiar manner. At each seventh, they kissed. The 21st was a complete embrace. The bell tinkled in the architrave, and they parted. The high priest then took from the altar a flask curiously shaped to imitate a phallus. The high priestess knelt and presented a boat-shaped cup of gold. He knelt opposite her and did not pour from the flask. Now the knights and dames began a long litany, first a dame in treble, then a knight in bass, then a response in chorus of all present with the organ. This chorus was, Evoe ho, Iake, Epelthon, Evoe Yao. Again and again it rose and fell. Towards its close, whether by stage effect or not, I could not swear, the light over the altar grew rosy, then purple. The high priest sharply and suddenly threw up his hand. Instant silence. He now poured out the wine from the flask. The high priestess gave it to the girl attendant, who bore it to all present. This was no ordinary wine. It had been said of vodka that it looks like water and tastes like fire. With this wine, the reverse is the case. It was of a rich, fiery gold in which flames of light danced and shook, but its taste was limpid and pure like fresh spring water. No sooner had I drunk of it, however, than I began to tremble. It was a most astonishing sensation. I can imagine a man feel thus as he awaits his executioner, when he has passed through fear and all is excitement. And is all excitement. I looked down my stall and saw that each was similarly affected. During the libation, the high priestess sang a hymn again in Greek. This time I recognized the words. They were those of an ancient ode to Aphrodite. The boy attendant now descended to the red cross, stooped and kissed it. He then danced upon it in such a way that he seemed to be tracing the patterns of a marvelous rose of gold, for the percussion caused a shower of bright dust to fall from the canopy. Meanwhile, the litany, different words but the same chorus, began again. This time it was a duet between the high priest, and the priestess. At each chorus, knights and dames bowed low. The girl moved round continuously, and the bowl passed. This ended in the exhaustion of the boy, who fell fainting on the cross. The girl immediately took the bowl and put it to his lips. Then she raised him, and with the assistance of the guardian of the sanctuary, led him out of the chapel. The bell again tinkled in the architrave. The herald blew a fanfare. The high priest and high priestess moved stately to each other and embraced, in the act unloosing the heavy golden robes which they wore. These fell, twin lakes of gold. I now saw her dressed in a garment of white watered silk, lined throughout, as it appeared later, with ermine. The high priest's vestment was an elaborate embroidery of every color, harmonized by exquisite yet robust art. He wore also a breastplate corresponding to the canopy, a sculptured beast at each corner in gold, while the 12 signs of the zodiac were symbolized by the stones of the breastplate. The bell tinkled yet again, and the herald again sounded his trumpet. The celebrants moved hand in hand down the nave, while the organ thundered forth its solemn harmonies. All the knights and dames rose and gave the secret sign of the rose Croix. It was at this part of the ceremony that things began to happen to me. I became suddenly aware that my body had lost both weight and tactile sensibility. My consciousness seemed to be situated no longer in my body. I mistook myself, as if I may use the phrase, for one of the stars in the canopy. In this way, I missed seeing the celebrants actually approach the cross. The bell tinkled again. I came back to myself, and then I saw that the high priestess, standing at the foot of the cross, had thrown her robe over it, so that the cross was no longer visible. There was only a board covered with ermine. She was now naked, but for her colored and jeweled headdress, and the heavy torque of gold about her neck, and the armlets and anklets that matched it. She began to sing in a soft, strange tongue, so low and smoothly that in my partial bewilderment I could not hear all, but I caught a few words. Yo Payan, Yo Pan, and a phrase in which the words Iao Sabao ended empathetically, a sentence in which I caught the words Eros, Thelema, and Sebazo. While she did this, she unloosed the breastplate and gave it to the girl attendant. The robe followed. I saw that they were naked and unashamed. For the first time there was absolute silence. Now, from 100 jets surrounded the board poured forth a perfumed purple smoke. The world was wrapped in a fond gauze of mist, sacred as the clouds upon the mountains. Then, at a signal given by the high priest, the bell tinkled once more. The celebrants stretched out their arms in the form of a cross, interlacing their fingers. Slowly they revolved through 3 circles and a half. She then laid him down upon the cross and took her own appointed place. The organ now again rolled forth its solemn music. I was lost to everything. Only this I saw, that the celebrants made no expected motion. The movements were extremely small, and yet extremely strong. This must have continued for a great length of time. To me it seemed as if eternity itself could not contain the variety of depth of my experiences. Tongue nor pen could record them, and yet I am fain to attempt the impossible. 1. I was certainly and undoubtedly the star in the canopy. The star was an incomprehensibly enormous world of pure flame. 2. I suddenly realized that the star was of no size whatever. It was not that the star shrank, but that it, or I, became suddenly conscious of infinite space. 3. An explosion took place. I was in consequence a point of light, infinitely small, yet infinitely bright, and this point was without position. 4. Consequently, this point was ubiquitous, and there was a feeling of infinite bewilderment, blinded after a very long time by a gush of infinite rapture. I use the word blinded as if under constraint. I should have preferred to use the words blotted out, or overwhelmed, or illuminated. 5. This infinite fullness, I have not described it as such, but it was suddenly changed into a feeling of infinite emptiness, which became conscious as a yearning. 6. These 2 feelings began to alternate, always with suddenness and without in any way overlapping, with great rapidity. 7. This alternation must have occurred 50 times. I had rather have said 100. 8. The 2 feelings suddenly became one. Again, the word explosion is the only that gives any idea of it. 9. I now seemed to be conscious of everything at once, that it was the same time one and many. I say at once, that is, I was not successively all things, but instantaneously. 10. This being, if I may call it being, seemed to drop into an infinite abyss of nothing. 11. While this falling lasted, the bell suddenly tinkled 3 times. I instantly became my normal self, yet with a constant awareness which has never left me to this hour, that the truth of the matter is not this normal I, but that which is still dropping into nothing. I am assured by those who know that I may be able to take up the thread if I attend another ceremony. The tinkle died away. The girl attendant ran quickly forward and folded the ermine over the celebrants. The herald blew a fanfare, and the knights and dames left their stalls. Advancing to the board, we took hold of the gilded carrying poles, and folded the herald in procession out of the chapel, bearing the litter to a small side chapel leading out of the middle anteroom, where we left it, the guard closing the doors. In silence we disrobed and left the house. About a mile through the woods we found my friend's automobile waiting. I asked him if that was a low mass. If that was a low mass, might I not be permitted to witness a high mass? Perhaps, he answered with a curious smile, if all they tell you of it is true. If all they tell of you is true. In the meanwhile, he permitted me to describe the ceremony and its results as faithfully as I was able, charging me only to give no indication of the city near which it took place. I am willing to indicate to initiates of the Rose Croix degree of masonry under proper charter from the genuine authorities, for there are spurious masons working under a forged charter, the address of a person willing to consider their fitness to affiliate to a chapter practicing similar rites. Very interesting. 16. Let's see if I can adjust the window here to show 16. See. 16. Will you show? One moment. Thunder. Aha. 16. I consider it supererogatory to continue my essay on the mysteries and my analysis of energized enthusiasm. The end. So that was Energized Enthusiasm by Aleister Crowley. I thank you all for watching, listening, paying attention. I found that fascinating personally. Where am I putting this? Put me over here or something. Okay, so you can see my face. Thank you all for watching. I really appreciate it. That was the entirety of the piece, essentially a treatise on the principles of sex magic. That was written in 1913, over 100 years ago. And it appears in Crowley's magazine. What was it called? I'm looking it up here. The Equinox, Volume 1, Number 9. As always, thank you, and I'll see you next time.